Lesson 3, Converting Fractions, Decimals, and Percentages. So in this lesson, we're going to start with fractions and convert them to both decimals and percentages. Then we'll learn how to convert between decimals and percentages. Let's take care of part 1. It says, label the place values of the digits in 3,259 and 648 thousandths. So this should be review for students. Here's a decimal point, and the 9 is in the ones place value, so I'll write it down. Here, the 5 is in the tens place value, followed by 2 in the hundreds place value, and the 3 is in the thousands place value. Moving on to the other side of the decimal point, the 6 is in the tenths place value. And make sure you write a THS so that it says tenths. Next, the 4 is in the hundredths place value. Again, make sure you have a THS. And finally, the 8 is in the thousandths place value. Make sure to include the THS for thousandths. Let's do part 2. Here, we're going to convert. So we have the fraction 1/4, and we're going to convert it to a percentage by using a proportion. Then we'll take that same fraction and convert to a decimal by using division. So let's start with converting it to a percentage. So I'll start with the fraction 1/4. And it says to use a proportion. So we'll set up our proportion equals blank over 100. And how do you get from 4 to 100? We multiply by 25. Multiply by 25 in the numerator. 1 times 25 is 25. 4 times 25 is 100, and it's already there. 25 hundredths is the same as 25 per 100, or 25%. So write down 25%. Let's move on to the next conversion. We're taking the same fraction and we're going to use division to convert to a decimal. So here, 1/4 can also be read as 1 divided by 4. So in this box, I'll write down 1 divided by 4. And we're going to need some decimal places here, so I'll add a couple of trailing zeros. Decimal point with 2 trailing zeros. And I'm actually going to use an index card to help me keep track of the place values. So let me use this card here. And let's start dividing. Before you do anything, make sure to take that decimal point and write it straight up here so that you don't forget it later. Cover up the digits in the dividend. 1 divided by 4, we can't do that, so slide over. 10 divided by 4, 4 goes into 10 2 times. 2 times 4 is 8. Subtract and slide. Bring down the next digit. 20 divided by 4 is 5. And 5 times 4 is 20. And we're done. So our answer here is 25 hundredths. And it says to go ahead and label the place values in your answer. So the 2 is in the tenths place value, write it down. And the 5 is in the hundredths place value. And that's why when you pronounce this number, since it ends in the hundredths place value, it's read as 25 hundredths. Let's recap what we've done. We took the fraction 1/4 and converted it to a percentage. We ended up with 25%. Then we took the same fraction of 1/4, converted to a decimal, and got the answer 25 hundredths. And this is where we can make the connection between percentages and decimals. So 25% is equivalent to 25 hundredths. And here's another connection you can make. Here we have 25 hundredths, and in our decimal we have 25 hundredths. Let's move on to letter C. Here it asks, how do you convert a percentage to a decimal? So if you start with 25%, how do you convert it into 25 hundredths? And the way you do that is there's a decimal point right here, even though it's not written, and we move the decimal point 2 places to the left. So the answer here would be 0.25, 0.25, or 25 hundredths. So we move the decimal point 2 places to the left. Let's write that down. And to remember that, students tell me that they think of the Beyonce song that goes, to the left, to the left. So just remember, move the decimal point 2 places to the left. Here it is. Move to the left, and you'll get the correct conversion. Let's move on to letter D. How do you convert a decimal to a percentage? So if you have 25 hundredths, how do you make it look like this? And instead of moving the decimal point 2 places to the left, we're going to move it 2 places to the right. So here's the decimal point. Move it to the right 2 times. 1, 2. Write it here, and you'll have 25% as the answer. So let's write down, move the decimal point 2 places to the right. In order for students to become fluent at these conversions, they need lots of practice. So let's look at a few examples. Here, we're going to convert percentages to decimals. And remember to move the decimal point 2 places to the left. Here's 2%, and even though it's not written, there's actually a decimal point right here after the 2. And we need to move that decimal point 2 places to the left. However, there's only 1 digit here, and students might get lost. So to prevent that, you can write a leading 0 right here. And now it's easier to move that decimal point 2 places to the left. 1, 2, write the decimal point, and our answer is 0.02, write it down, or 2 hundredths. Now here's an important question that might pop up when we're working with decimals. Here, writing 0.02 is correct. It's also correct to write 0.02. So which one should we do? And I tell students to go ahead and write that leading 0 there. And of course, students are going to ask why. So here's how I explain it to them. So if we leave out the leading 0 and just write 0.02, since that decimal point is so small, sometimes people don't realize that it's there and they tend to ignore it. But if you add the leading 0, it's a signal to people that there's a decimal point there. And you'll see a clearer example of that when we get to the next box. So let's look at the next example. Here we have 20%, and even though it's not written, there's a decimal point right here. Move the decimal point 2 places to the left, and our answer is 0.20. So write it down. And this is read as 20 hundredths, and we're actually going to have students drop the trailing 0 and just write it as 2 tenths. And here's an example of how writing a leading 0 can help prevent confusion. If you look at 2 tenths, sometimes students won't write that decimal point clearly enough, and they'll write it like this. And if you don't notice it, this looks like 2 instead of 2 tenths. But if you add a leading 0 in front of it, that's a signal to people that there's a decimal point there. And students should write that decimal point more clearly anyway. So we'll write our answer as 0.2, just like this, or 2 tenths. A few more examples. Here, move the decimal point 2 places to the left, and we have 0.34, or 34 hundredths. This is 0.15, or 15 hundredths. And once again, add a leading 0 to make it easier to move the decimal point. Our answer here is 0.01, or 1 hundredth. Let's look at a couple of the starred examples. Here we have 253%, and a common mistake that students will make is they'll write 0.253, which is incorrect. They still have to move the decimal point 2 places to the left. So start here, go 1, 2, and here it's 2.53, 2.53, or 2 and 53 hundredths. One more example. Here's 45.2. So move the decimal 2 places to the left. 1, 2, goes right here. And the answer is 0.452. And since it ends in the thousandths place, this number is read as 452 thousandths. Let's look at a few examples on the other side. Here we're converting decimals to percentages. So here's 53 hundredths, and we're going to move the decimal 1, 2 places over and end up with 53% as our answer. Next one, 1, 2, and we end up with 2% as our answer here. Now the next one's a little tricky for students when they first see it. Here, they see a number 2, so they think the answer is 2%. But that's wrong because this gave us 2%. So students should write a trailing 0. Now move the decimal point over 2 places to the right. 1, 2, and you notice we end up with 20% as our answer. Let's look at 2 of the start examples. Here's 1 and 53 hundredths. So we'll move the decimal point 2 places to the right, 1, 2, and we end up with the answer 153%. That boggles students when they first see that because they're not used to seeing percentages over 100%. Last example, 49 thousandths. Move the decimal point 1, 2 places over, and we have 4.9%.